Power-hungry cop accuses black security guard of trespassing. Then the bank manager calls him boss. There is a kind of knowledge that does not wear a badge. It does not carry a weapon or flash credentials at the door. It does not announce itself at the threshold of a room and expect the room to clear. It lives in the hands and the eyes and the accumulated memory of a person who has walked the same rooms, the same corridors, the same secured spaces for long enough that the rooms have stopped being rooms and become something more like a language. A set of cues and conditions that speak constantly to anyone trained to read them. A camera angle slightly off from where it was last quarter. A door seal that has begun to compress unevenly. A lock mechanism that responds one beat slower than it should. A motion sensor mounted 3 inches too high in relation to the counter below it. A cable tie at the back of the server stack that has been under tension so long it is showing white stress marks at the joint. These are the signals. They do not announce themselves. Most people move past them without registering anything at all. Some people were trained to catch them, and some of those people were trained so thoroughly that catching them is no longer a conscious act. It is simply how they move through a building. It is the language they speak without translating. Wendell Arrington. James moved through buildings that way. He had been doing it for 29 years. He had started at 28, fresh out of a 2-year security management program at a state technical college in the eastern part of the state with a temporary work permit and a belief that the field would either hold him or it would not. He was not naively optimistic about this. He had grown up in a working family in a part of a city where belief and outcome did not always correspond. And he had learned early that a belief in one's own capacity was a necessary starting point, but not a guarantee. What it guaranteed was the attempt. The rest would be the result of whether the attempt was sustained and whether the work was actually done. The work was done. The field held him. It held him through the early years, doing overnight shift work at a medical complex in the city. Long, quiet nights in a building that was never fully dark and never fully still, where the work was a combination of perimeter checks and incident response, and the kind of steady presence that a building full of sick people needed, without knowing it, needed it. He took the overnight shifts because they were the ones available when he started, and because the hours suited him in a way he had not expected. He found that he did his best thinking in a quiet building at 2 a.m, moving through the corridors with a flashlight and a radio, and the particular alertness of someone responsible for a space that other people had trusted him to protect. He was good at it from the beginning. Not in a flashy way, in the quiet way that matters more. He held that job for 3 years and spent 2 of them studying for his first certification examination. He passed it on the first attempt. He took the second examination 6 months later and passed that too. He moved from the overnight position into a supervisory role at a commercial real estate company that was growing its private security assessment function and needed someone who could walk a building and produce a written account of what it found. He did that for 4 years. He learned how to write reports not just to fill out forms, but to write documents that told a story that connected current conditions to prior conditions to future risk, that read like a coherent professional analysis rather than a checklist with comments. He learned this from a man named Howard Braverman, who was the senior assessor at the company and who had been doing security work since the mid-1980s. And who had the kind of specific, accumulated knowledge that only comes from doing one thing carefully for a very long time. Howard was not an easy teacher. He marked up Wendell's early reports with a red pen and left them on his desk with no commentary except the marks. The first report came back looking like a wound. The second one was better. By the 5th one, the red marks were down to 2 or 3 per page. By the end of the first year, Howard stopped marking them up and started simply initialing the cover page, which was his version of approval. That meant something to Wendell. He kept working. Those years with Howard Braverman were the years Wendell learned what the work actually was underneath the certifications and the checklists. The work was about time, about the relationship between a building and the cumulative record of observation applied to it. A single assessment told you what was true today. 12 assessments told you something a single assessment could never tell you: the direction things were moving, whether the deterioration was accelerating or stable, whether the corrections were holding or reverting, whether the security infrastructure was being genuinely maintained or merely documented. The difference between those two things was the difference between a building that protected what it contained and a building that had paperwork suggesting it did. Howard understood this distinction and had built his practice around it. Wendell absorbed it and kept it, and when he eventually built his own practice, the distinction was the foundation of how he worked. By the time he was 40, he held 4 professional certifications. He had been managing a team of 3 assessors. He had a reputation in the local security industry as someone whose reports were unusually good and whose recommendations were unusually precise. And he had started to understand that the ceiling of what he could do within someone else's organization was lower than what he was capable of building if the organization were his own. He did not make the decision to leave quickly. He spent 2 years thinking about it and saving money and talking to other business owners and understanding what the legal and financial architecture of a small service business actually looked like from the inside. He did not want to start something he could not sustain. He was not interested in the idea of business ownership as an identity. He was interested in it as a structure that would allow him to do the work he was good at under terms he controlled. He left the company at 44. He had 6 clients already committed before he submitted his resignation, not recruited in any way that violated his employment agreement, but relationships he had built over years that were willing to follow his professional judgment wherever it led. He filed for his state security contractor license. He found the office space. He put the name on the door, James Security Services, his name first, his work second. The order of that mattered to him in a way he did not fully articulate to anyone, but understood completely himself. The name was not vanity. It was accountability. If the work was good, the name would mean something. If the work was poor, the name would be attached to that too. He was not willing to produce poor work, so the arrangement was acceptable. By the time he was 57, James Security Services held contracts with 6 businesses in Millbrook, a mid-sized city in the Upper South, in the region of industrial parks and small commercial corridors, and established residential neighborhoods that had been the same city for 30 years, and was beginning to change in small, incremental ways that meant something to the people who had always lived there. The 6 contracts represented 11 to 13 assessments per quarter, depending on the scope of service each client had elected. The assessments covered physical security infrastructure, cameras, access points, locks, door and window, hardware lighting, alarm panel conditions, motion sensor, placement, exterior, perimeter vulnerabilities, and anything else in the category of how a building either protected its contents or failed to. He wrote reports. He made recommendations. He followed up. He tracked corrections across quarters so that the data built into a picture of a facility's security over time, not just a snapshot of a single moment. The contracts were not glamorous. None of the 6 businesses were high profile. One was a dental practice on the south side of Millbrook that had been a client from the beginning. The dentist, a man named Dr. Folake, had been one of the 6 original commitments. One was a small credit union branch that had brought Wendell in after a camera system failure revealed they had 6 months of corrupted footage nobody had noticed. 2 were retail businesses on the same commercial strip owned by members of the same extended family who had been referred by the credit union. 1 was a private medical record storage facility on the edge of the industrial zone, which had specific compliance requirements around physical security that made a contracted assessor effectively necessary. and one was Millbrook First Community Bank on the corner of Halden Street and Prospect Avenue in the city's downtown commercial district. The bank was a two-story building with a full retail banking floor. 3 private offices, a manager's suite, a safety deposit vault room, a vault anteroom with its own access control panel, a security equipment room that housed the camera servers and alarm infrastructure, and a rear corridor that connected all of these non-public spaces behind the public-facing floor. It was not the largest of his 6 clients. It was the most complex in terms of security infrastructure, and it was the one that required the most thorough documentation because of the regulatory environment around bank physical security. Wendell understood this environment well. He had made it a point to understand it thoroughly before he signed the contract, because he believed you did not take on a client whose specific professional context you did not understand. Wendell had been assessing Millbrook First Community Bank for 11 years. He had done it quarterly every quarter without interruption through every year of the contract. That was 44 assessments, 44 walks through the same building, 44 sets of eyes on the same infrastructure, 44 reports sent to the same branch manager by 5 o'clock on the same assessment day. He knew the building the way you know a place you have been accountable to for over a decade. He knew where every camera was mounted and what angle each one covered and how the angles had shifted or degraded over the quarters he had been watching them. He knew the vault anteroom access panel's history when it had been serviced, when its firmware had been updated, when the keypad had been replaced after a malfunction 2 years ago, because the number 5 key had developed a resistance issue and had been giving inconsistent signals to the panel processor. He knew the security equipment room the way a physician knows a patient's medical history, not abstractly but specifically and documentedly from years of direct observation carefully recorded. On the morning of the 45th assessment, he drove to the bank as he always did in his personal vehicle. He was wearing his work uniform, a navy jacket with the JSS emblem on the left chest, a small, precise insignia, navy blue on white, the initials in a clean block font with the firm name spelled out beneath them in a smaller type size, and dark slacks and dark shoes that were polished. He had his assessment clipboard, which contained the current quarter's inspection form, a sheet for notes, a copy of the prior quarter's report for reference comparison, and a pen clipped to the board's metal top bar. He had his state security contractor license in his jacket's inner breast pocket, laminated with his name, his license number, his firm name, and the expiration date clearly printed on the front face. He had had this license in one renewal iteration or another for 15 years. He had never once been asked to produce it by anyone at Millbrook First Community Bank. Everyone there knew him. He arrived at 9:47 in the morning. He parked in the small lot adjacent to the building in the spot that had become his by the force of routine, not designated, not marked with his name. Just the third space from the left on the eastern edge of the lot, which happened to be the one that was almost always open at this hour, and which he had parked in on the first assessment and on most of the subsequent 43. He got out. He walked to the bank's side entrance, which was the staff entrance that clients under active contract were authorized to use. He had the door code. He had held the door code for 11 years. The code had been changed twice in that period, and both times Doreen Ashby had called him the day the change took effect and given him the new sequence. That was protocol. That was how a client relationship worked when the client understood what their security assessor was for and valued the access that made the assessments possible. He entered the code. The door unlocked. He stepped inside. The rear corridor of Millbrook First Community Bank was not a public space. It was not accessible from the main floor without an access badge or a staff escort. It ran along the back of the building, connecting the manager's suite to the private offices, to the vault anteroom, to the security equipment room. It was about 70 feet long and perhaps 8 feet wide, lit with overhead fluorescents that cast a clean, even light on the commercial-grade carpet and the painted drywall. There were 3 cameras in the corridor. Wendell had included the recommendation for each of them in successive quarterly reports spread across the first 4 years of the contract, and the bank had acted on each recommendation within the specified timeline. The cameras covered the full length of the corridor with overlapping fields of view, which meant there was no point in the corridor that was not covered by at least one camera. He had checked their alignment in his last quarterly assessment and noted all 3 as functioning within acceptable parameters. He had also checked the corridor access reader at the main floor entrance, the one that required an active badge to enter from the public side, and noted the firmware was current. He had moved about 30 feet down the corridor and was standing approximately 40 feet from the security equipment room door, clipboard in hand, making notes about the condition of the wall-mounted access reader near the vault. Anteroom door, checking the bezel for cracking, verifying the indicator light sequence was responding correctly, testing the door release with the authorized card he carried for assessment purposes when Officer Nate Corbin came through the far end of the corridor. Nate Corbin was 31 years old. He had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 4 years, having completed the department's standard training program at 27, and spent his first 2 years on patrol in the West and North residential districts before being reassigned to the downtown patrol area, which included the commercial corridor where Millbrook First Community Bank was located. He was not a bad officer in the broad stroke sense. He showed up. He completed his assignments. He had not accumulated a discipline record that would flag him for supervisory attention, except for the one prior complaint which had been classified as inconclusive and had not altered his assignment status. He was the kind of officer who thought of himself as competent and professional, and who had built an internal story about himself that was consistent and that he did not have a particular inclination to examine. He had received the call at 9:51 in the morning. It came through the non-emergency line routed to patrol. The bank's supervisor on duty, a man named Clayton Webb, 26 years old, 4 months in his position, had called after a teller flagged an unknown individual in the restricted corridor. Clayton had not thought to call the branch manager. He had not thought to check the contracted services folder. He had thought to call the police because an unknown individual in a restricted area at a bank is the kind of situation that the word restricted is designed to produce a response to, and Clayton did not yet know enough about how this particular bank operated to interrupt that response with a question. The teller was Amanda Fitch. She was 23, 3 weeks at the bank, still in the stage of her employment where she was learning the physical geography of the building, the names of her colleagues, the procedures and protocols that governed a job she had been hired to do correctly. She had been trained on teller operations. She had not been briefed on the contracted security assessor. In her 3 weeks at the bank, she had not been present on an assessment day. She did not know the name Wendell James. She had not seen the JSS emblem before. What she had seen was a man she did not recognize in a uniform she did not recognize moving through the corridor near the vault anteroom with a clipboard. She had done what she thought she was supposed to do. These were the origins of the call. Not malice, not certainty. A cascade of incomplete information moving through the available channels, producing the outcome that incomplete information in an institutional setting tends to produce the involvement of an external authority before any internal verification had been attempted. Amanda had done what the institutional environment trained her to do. Clayton had done what a new supervisor with 4 months of experience does when a teller flags something he cannot explain. Neither of them was malicious. Neither of them had checked whether the branch manager was in her office. Neither of them knew that the 40-foot walk to Doreen Ashby's door was available to them. The institution had protocols for unknown individuals in restricted areas, and the protocol said external authority, and neither of them had been given enough context about how this particular building operated to interrupt that protocol with a question. The 44 assessments that had preceded this one, the 11 years of quarterly visits, the name in the sign-in protocol in the contracted services folder, None of these were yet part of Amanda Fitch's and Clayton Webb's knowledge of Millbrook First Community Bank. They would be after today, but they were not on this morning. Corbin came down the corridor. He was in full patrol uniform. He was moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had been told there was a problem and was arriving to resolve it. He was not running. He was not hostile in his body language exactly. But he had a defined posture, the particular forward-set quality of a person whose orientation to the situation ahead of them is already fixed, who has formed a working classification of the scene, and is now moving to execute the appropriate response to that classification. He was about 10 feet from Wendell when he spoke. He said, "Sir, I need you to explain your presence in this area." Wendell looked at him. He had the particular quality of stillness of a man who has been in this position before. Not this exact position, not this corridor, not this building, but this category of position. The position in which a man in a professional uniform carrying professional documentation in a space he is professionally authorized to occupy is asked to explain himself by someone who has not yet verified anything but whose posture already contains the outcome. He knew what he was looking at. He had known what he was looking at before Corbin finished crossing the last 10 feet of corridor. He had known it the moment he heard the footsteps coming toward him with that particular rhythm. He took a breath that did not show on his face. He had been doing that for a long time, too. He said, "I am a contracted security assessor. My firm holds the security services contract for this bank. I conduct quarterly assessments of the building's security infrastructure. This is a regularly scheduled assessment. I have conducted 44 of them in this building." He said this clearly and completely. He did not rush the sentence or compress it. He gave Corbin the full information and gave him time to process it. This was deliberate. He understood that his first statement in a moment like this one was likely to be the most important statement because it was the one that either resolved the situation or revealed what category of situation it actually was. Corbin looked at him. He looked at the clipboard. He looked at the jacket emblem, the small JSS insignia on the left chest, which he may or may not have been able to read at his angle, but which was visibly a uniform insignia of some kind. He said, "I have no record of a contracted arrangement at this location. This is a secured area, and you are not authorized bank staff. I need you to accompany me outside." Wendell said, "I am authorized to be here under a contract held between James Security Services and Millbrook First Community Bank. The branch manager is Doreen Ashby. She is in her office this morning. I'm asking you to contact her before we proceed." The request was reasonable. It was the most reasonable response available to both of them. The branch manager was in her office 40 feet down the same corridor. Contacting her would have taken 60 seconds and would have produced a complete verified answer to every question Corbin was operating on. Wendell was not asking Corbin to take his word for anything. He was asking Corbin to take 30 steps and knock on a door. Corbin said, "We can sort it out outside." There was a pause. It was not long. Wendell was not a man who used pauses theatrically or performatively. But he was a man who had learned through 29 years in professional settings and through the longer education of living as a black man in a country with well-documented patterns, around moments exactly like this one, that the pause before compliance was sometimes the only moment available to place something on the record without it being read as resistance. He used the pause carefully. He said clearly and in a voice calibrated to carry without being raised, "I am complying. I am also stating for the record that I have identified myself as a contracted security professional, that I have asked that the branch manager be contacted before I am removed from this building, and that this building is a client of mine. I am complying under protest of the procedure being followed here." He said every word of this with the tone he would use to read a follow-up item from a quarterly report. Measured, precise, calm, documented. Not for Corbin's benefit primarily, though Corbin was hearing it. For the cameras, for the record, for the version of events that would exist regardless of what happened next. Corbin said, "Understood. Let's go." He put a hand on Wendell's shoulder. It was not a rough gesture. It was the firm, directional gesture of someone physically communicating a direction that their words had already stated, the body language of authority asserting itself through contact when it believes the contact is appropriate. The contact itself was the problem, not its intensity, its presumption. The presumption that this man in this uniform carrying these professional materials in this building was the kind of situation that required the hand and not the door 40 feet behind them. Wendell moved. He moved because he had made a decision years ago about how to conduct himself in client environments when a confrontation became possible. The decision was not here, not in a client's building, not in front of the client's staff, not in a space where the disruption would follow the professional relationship long after the incident itself was resolved. He was a contractor. The building was a client's. The walls had cameras, and the corridor had 3 of them, and everything that happened here was being recorded, and the record would say what happened, and the record was something he trusted in a way he did not always trust the immediate situation. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried step of a man who was complying completely and had documented that compliance in his own words, and who understood that the documentation was now the most important thing he had produced in that corridor today. They were 10 feet from the entrance to the public floor when Doreen Ashby came out of her office. She heard it before she saw it. 14 years of managing a branch teaches a manager the acoustic signature of a normal day in her building, the particular frequencies and rhythms of everything functioning within its expected range. The sound of the rear corridor at 10 in the morning was a known quantity. The HVAC low hum. The occasional step of a staff member moving between offices. The muffled voice of a teller with a customer at the front. These were the sounds of a bank operating normally, and Doreen Ashby carried them in the background of her awareness, the way you carry the sound of your own house, not consciously, but registrably, so that a deviation registers immediately as wrong without requiring identification. What she heard was footsteps that were wrong, more than one set, moving together in the corridor at a pace and rhythm that said one person was directing the movement of another. She was on the phone when she heard a call with the regional compliance coordinator about an upcoming regulatory review, and she did not say, "Excuse me," or "Hold on." She said, "I need to call you back." She ended the call. She came out of her office doorway with her reading glasses still pushed up to the top of her head, which is where they went when she was moving from a seated task to an active one. She came into the corridor and she saw 2 figures. A police officer she did not recognize, and the man the officer was steering toward the lobby door. She recognized the second figure before she fully processed the first. She had known Wendell James for 11 years. She knew the way he stood, and the way he moved, and the navy jacket with the JSS emblem that he had been wearing on every quarterly assessment visit for as long as she could remember. She knew him with the complete effortless recognition of someone you have seen regularly in a specific professional context for over a decade. She said, "Officer." The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It was said in the tone of a person who is accustomed to being heard in the spaces they occupy, the tone of a branch manager in her own building, naming the person she is addressing with a precision that required only one word. Corbin stopped. He turned. She looked at him. She was 51 years old, with the compact, assured bearing of someone who had run this branch through 2 ownership transitions. One economic downturn, a complete branch renovation in 2019. A global pandemic that reshaped how banking was conducted, and every category of personnel and operational challenge a mid-size community bank branch could produce over 14 years. She was in her business clothes, a gray jacket, a light blouse, shoes that were appropriate to the work she was doing and the building she was doing it in. She was not a physically imposing person, but she occupied the space she was standing in with a completeness that had nothing to do with size. It was the completeness that comes from being unambiguously the responsible party in the room you are standing in for a long time consistently. It was not performed. It was not asserted. It simply was. She looked at Corbin. She looked at Wendell. She said, "That is Wendell James. He runs the security firm that protects this building." Corbin looked at her. He looked at Wendell. He said this man was in the secured corridor without staff identification, and I received a report that... She said, "I know what you received. We have a new employee who has not been briefed on our contracted services. That is a training matter, and I will address it today. Wendell James has been conducting quarterly security assessments at this bank for 11 years. He has a door code and a contract, and his name is on the sign-in protocol that has been in our security services folder since I authorized it." Corbin said I was not informed of any contracted arrangement when I responded to the call. She said you were called before anyone here had verified who was in the building. That was a mistake that originated with us, and I take responsibility for it. But that mistake does not change who this man is or what his authorization is in this building. And it does not change the fact that you attempted to remove a contracted professional from a client's space without first speaking with the building's responsible party. I was in my office, 40 feet from where you found him. You walked past my door. She was not angry in the way that would have made this easier for Corbin to categorize. She was precise. The precision was in its way less comfortable than anger would have been. She paused. She was not making a speech. She was stating a fact and allowing Corbin the time to absorb it. Then she turned to Wendell. She said, "I'm sorry, Wendell." He looked at her. He said, "It's all right, Doreen." He said it with the economy of a professional who has already done the work of processing what happened and has moved to the question of what comes next. The words were true in one register and not true in another, and both of those registers were real. And Wendell James understood both of them completely, and the understanding was itself a form of the quiet work that the morning had required of him before the assessment had even started. Doreen turned back to Corbin. She said, "Come on back, Wendell. He has a job to finish." And she walked with Wendell back down the corridor toward the security equipment room. She walked with him the way you walk with someone you know in a space you share. Not ceremoniously, not making a statement, simply moving in the same direction toward the same objective. Because the objective was correct, and the direction was correct, and that was what the moment required. Behind them, Officer Nate Corbin stood in the space between the back corridor and the public floor with his hat and his notepad and the particular weight of a moment that does not resolve cleanly, that sits with you in the way things sit with you when the accounting you have carried about yourself meets something that does not confirm it. Doreen Ashby had been branch manager at Millbrook First Community Bank since she was 37 years old. She had been hired by the prior regional director, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had a gift for identifying operational capacity in people who had not yet been given the space to demonstrate it at scale. Doreen had come to the branch manager role from an assistant manager position at a larger branch in the city where she had been consistently the most capable person in the room and had not been given much opportunity to act on that capacity. Sandra recognized it. She made the appointment. It turned out to be a good appointment. Doreen had spent the first 2 years of her tenure doing what she always did in a new context, understanding everything about it. She audited the branch's operational structure, its staffing model, its vendor relationships, its contracted service arrangements, and its physical infrastructure. She found gaps. She found redundancies. She found 3 contracted services that were costing the branch money and producing nothing of demonstrable value. She terminated those contracts. She found 2 others that were valuable but had been negotiated poorly in the original terms. She renegotiated them. And she found a gap. The branch had no independent security assessment function. Its physical security had been self-assessed by the bank's internal facilities team, which was fine for routine maintenance, but was not the same as an independent professional review of whether the security infrastructure was actually doing what it was supposed to do. She put out a request for proposals in her 3rd year. She received 4 responses. 3 were from large regional security firms whose proposals were expensive, generic, and clearly templated from their standard materials without specific attention to the bank's actual building or situation. The 4th was from James Security Services, which was then 2 years old and operating out of a small office on the north side of Millbrook. The proposal was not the longest of the four. It was the most specific. Wendell had walked the exterior of the building before submitting the proposal, a detail Doreen noticed because his proposal included a reference to the loading area access door angle that could only have come from someone who had physically looked at it. He had also included his firm's complete license documentation, bonding certificates, and insurance certificates without being asked, and he had referenced the relevant bank security compliance framework in a way that said he had read it rather than skimmed it. She invited him in. They met in a conference room. He brought a binder. She called his references. She signed the contract. In 11 years, Wendell had delivered 44 reports. Doreen had read every one of them. Not skimmed, actually read in the way you read a document you are responsible for acting on. She had developed over the first year a particular appreciation for the longitudinal dimension of the reports. The way Wendell referenced prior findings, tracked conditions across quarters, and flagged developments that were only visible as developments when you saw them against the prior data. A camera mount that had been exactly correct for 6 quarters and had moved 1 degree in the 7th. A motion sensor whose sensitivity had been adjusted in response to a prior recommendation and whose adjustment had produced a new gap. The reports were not just descriptions of the building as it currently stood. They were a running account of the building's security health over time. She had learned to read them the way a physician learns to read a chart. She trusted his judgment. She trusted it the way you trust something that has been verified by a long record of accuracy, not emotionally, but evidentially. When Wendell said a camera needed realigning, the camera needed realigning. When he said a door seal was approaching the threshold for replacement, it was approaching the threshold. When he said something was satisfactory, it was actually satisfactory. The 11 years had not produced a single instance in which his assessment had proven wrong, and they had produced multiple instances in which an item he had flagged had been fixed before it became a more expensive or more serious problem. This was the professional reality that Corbin had attempted to remove from the building at 9:53 on a Thursday morning. After she walked Wendell to the security equipment room and left him to begin his work, Doreen returned to her office. She went directly to the locked file cabinet where she kept the branch's active service contracts and retrieved 2 items. The first was the service contract between Millbrook First Community Bank and James Security Services, the current annual renewal 7 months old with Doreen's signature in black ink on the left line of the cover page and Wendell's signature in the same black ink on the right. The contract specified the quarterly assessment schedule, the access authorization provisions, including the specific language about door codes and entry procedures and the reporting requirements. It was 11 pages long. The cover page was clear. Both signatures were on it. The second was the photocopy of Wendell's state security contractor license that James Security Services had provided at original contract execution and at each renewal since. It was a single sheet in a clear sleeve in the back of the contract folder, the license number, the firm name, the licensee name, the expiration date, all current, all in order. She came back out to the corridor. Corbin was still there. He had his notebook out and was writing. He looked up when she came out. She placed both documents on the counter of the teller station at the corridor entrance. She said, "This is the active service contract for James Security Services. Both signatures are on the cover page. This is a copy of Mr. James's state security contractor license. This documentation has been on file at this branch for 11 years." Corbin looked at the documents. He picked up the contract. He read the cover page. He set it down. He picked up the license copy. He read it. He set it down. He was quiet. He said the teller who called reported an unknown individual in a restricted area. "I was responding to a report." Doreen said, "I understand the call you responded to. The teller was 3 weeks into her employment and had not been briefed on our contracted assessor. That is a gap in our onboarding protocol, and I will address it. But that gap does not change Mr. James's authorization in this building, and it does not change the fact that you attempted to remove a contracted professional from a client's building without contacting the building's manager who was present in her office 40 feet from where you found him. Corbin said in an unknown individual situation in a restricted area. She said the building manager is the first call, not the lobby, not the parking lot. The building manager. I was here. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of a fact with nothing to argue against it. Corbin was standing in it. She said, I will be filing a formal complaint about the procedure followed today. I want you to know that before you leave. It is not personal. It is procedural, and the procedure was not followed correctly. Corbin said he understood. He said he was sorry for the inconvenience. She said it was more than an inconvenience. She thanked him and went back to her office and pulled up the complaint form and began to write. Amanda Fitch at her teller station on the main floor heard none of this. She knew that the officer had arrived and that something was happening in the back. She did not know what the resolution was. She continued working, processing transactions, greeting customers, doing the job she had been hired to do. At some point in the mid-morning, the branch supervisor, Clayton Webb, stopped by her station and said that the man she had flagged was actually a contracted security assessor, had been for 11 years, and that she would be briefed on the contracted services during her next onboarding session. He said she had done the right thing by flagging something she didn't recognize. He said he should have known who to call, and he hadn't, and that was on him. Amanda said, okay. She went back to work. She would remember the morning. Not in the way Wendell James would remember it, but she would remember that she had flagged something she didn't understand, and that the outcome had been more complicated than flagging it had felt, and that complexity would be part of how she understood the building and the people in it going forward. The security equipment room at Millbrook First Community Bank was approximately 12 feet by 15 feet. It had been modified 3 times over the 11 years of Wendell's contract, once, when the bank upgraded its camera infrastructure from an 8-camera to a 12-camera system in year 3. Once, when the alarm panel was replaced with a newer model after the manufacturer ended firmware support for the prior version in year 7. And once, when additional rack storage was added for archived camera footage drives after the bank's compliance team determined the prior archive schedule did not meet the retention requirements. Wendell had documented each modification in the relevant quarterly report and assessed each change's impact on the room's security function. He knew the room with the thorough specific familiarity of a place that you have returned to 44 times, with the explicit professional purpose of understanding everything about it. He stood in the doorway for a moment after Doreen walked back to her office. This was his practice. At the beginning of any room assessment, he stood still and looked before he moved. He was taking in the room as it currently was and comparing it against how it had been not just the prior quarter, but across the accumulated layers of observation. This was the part of the work that looked like nothing from the outside. A man standing in a doorway looking at a room not moving for perhaps 30 seconds. But the 30 seconds were doing work. The 30 seconds were the process by which the current state of the room was being read against the stored record of every prior version of the room looking for anything that had changed. He had just had a police officer's hand on his shoulder. He had just had to say his own name and professional designation to a woman who had been signing his contracts for 11 years. He had just experienced the specific particular weight of a morning that required composure in a situation that had not required composure to be earned in any fair sense. He was carrying all of that. He was not performing the absence of it. He was simply doing what he had always done, setting the weight in the correct place, and attending to what needed attending to, because the building's camera infrastructure did not adjust itself, and the door seals did not announce when they had reached the threshold for replacement, and the work was the work, regardless of the morning's additional contents. He stepped into the room and began on the left side working clockwise. He checked the camera server unit first. This was always the first check in the equipment room. The server was the processing hub for the entire 12-camera system, and its status was the most consequential single data point in the room. He looked at the indicator lights, power, steady green recording, steady green storage capacity in the yellow zone, but not yet at the alert threshold. He checked the connection status display on the front panel, reading through the 12-channel readouts. All channels showing active. He checked the cable routing on the back of the unit, the organized bundle of cables that had been properly routed and secured when the system was installed, and which he checked each quarter for signs of heat damage, chafing, or stress on the connection points. No issues. He made a note camera server unit, all channels active storage at 68% capacity. Recommend archival review before next quarter to maintain margin. He moved to the alarm panel. He opened the panel cover with the flathead key from his jacket pocket, a small tool specific to this panel model, which he carried in the chest pocket of his jacket alongside his phone. He checked the internal status readout, the battery backup status light, and the tamper detection indicator. All within normal parameters. The battery backup was at 94%, which was satisfactory. Anything above 80% was acceptable. He made a note. He closed the panel and secured the cover. He moved to the rear wall where the camera feeds were displayed on a monitor array, 4 screens in a 2x2 configuration showing the current feeds from the bank's 12 cameras in a grid format, 3 cameras per screen. He stood in front of the monitors and looked at each feed in turn. He was not watching for activity. He was checking angles, the precise framing of each camera's field of view, the coverage overlaps between adjacent cameras, the condition of the feeds in terms of clarity and color calibration. He had the prior quarter's notation in his head. All feeds satisfactory at last assessment, with camera 7 showing no deviation from documented angle. 3 of the 4 screens were exactly as he expected. 11 of the 12 feeds were visually correct. The angles matched his memory of where each camera was pointed. The coverage overlaps were intact. The image quality was consistent with the prior quarter. The 12th feed was camera 7. Camera 7 covered the rear exterior wall between the loading area access door and the staff parking gate. He looked at its feed, and he knew immediately that something had changed. Not dramatically, it was still showing the rear exterior wall, still showing the loading area, still showing the parking gate. But the framing was wrong. It was off by a few degrees counterclockwise. In 11 years of looking at camera 7's feed, he had developed a precise mental image of where the frame edge should fall, specifically, where the right edge of the frame should intersect with the far corner of the parking gate support post. The intersection was wrong. The frame had shifted. The camera's mounting had drifted. He wrote, camera 7 angular drift approximately 4 degrees counterclockwise from documented position. Overlap with camera 8 reduced. Blind spot present in exterior rear zone approximately 6 to 8 feet wide at fence line. Recommend mount adjustment and re-screw. Follow up within 30 days. He looked at the feed for another moment, thinking through the geometry of the exterior. He knew the layout of the rear exterior wall as well as he knew the layout of the room he was standing in. He drew a reference diagram in the margin of his note sheet. A quick sketch of the exterior wall, the fence line, the positions of cameras 7 and 8, and the gap in their coverage overlap. He did it from memory. It was accurate. He moved to the security equipment room door. He checked the frame alignment first, running his eye along the gap between the door edge and the frame to confirm the door was hanging correctly. Good. He checked the latch hardware. Good. Then he ran his right hand along the door edge, feeling the compression of the rubber door seal against the frame, starting at the top and working down. At the top, good compression, consistent contact. Down the latch, side, good. Down to the lower hinge side quadrant, his fingers found the gap. It was not visible to the eye. The seal looked intact from a distance, but under his fingers on the hinge side, in the lower 8 inches, he could feel the place where the rubber had stopped making full contact with the frame. It had compressed unevenly over time and had reached the point where the material was separating from the door edge along that section. The gap was less than a millimeter at its widest. It was at the threshold where replacement was warranted. He wrote security equipment room door seal separation at lower hinge side quadrant approximately 8 inches. Compression wear consistent with seal age. Does not currently breach security containment but is at replacement threshold. Recommend full seal replacement within 30 days. He finished the room. He moved through the rest of the assessment vault anteroom, private office wing, exterior perimeter, main floor. Camera positions as viewed from the equipment room feeds with the same methodical progression. 2 hours and 14 minutes total. One finding from the assessment that had been interrupted and then resumed. 2 findings from the work itself. When he came back down the corridor, the building was in its mid-morning rhythm. The teller stations were processing customers. The offices were occupied. The sounds of a working bank filled the space in the way they always filled it. Wendell walked the corridor the same way he had walked it for 11 years, directly purposefully with the bearing of someone who belongs in the space he is moving through. He stopped at Doreen's office. Her door was open. She was on the phone, but she saw him and held up one finger. He waited. She finished the call and looked at him. He said, "Done. 2 items on the follow-up list. Camera 7 has some mount drift and the equipment room door seal needs replacing. I'll have the report to you by 5. She said, "I'll be here." He said, "Thanks, Doreen." She said, "Wendell." She paused. She said, "I meant everything I said this morning, about what you know and what you bring to this building." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I know you did. I'll see you next quarter." He went out through the staff entrance, the door locked behind him. He walked to his car and put the clipboard on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment with the engine off. Not thinking about any one thing, just letting the morning settle into its actual shape. The weight of it, the record of it, the fact that it had happened and would be documented and the documentation would say what it said. Then he started the car and drove to his office. The formal complaint that Doreen Ashby filed against Officer Nate Corbin moved through the city's complaint review process with the quiet procedural momentum of a document that is precisely written and substantively complete. Doreen did not file documents carelessly. The complaint specified the date, the time, the sequence of events. The specific procedural failure to contact the building's responsible party prior to attempting to remove an authorized contracted professional, and it was accompanied by 2 attachments, a copy of the active service contract and a copy of Wendell's state security contractor license. The complaint was 6 paragraphs. Every sentence was precise. There was no emotional language in it. There was no language designed to persuade. The facts stated in order were the argument. The argument was sufficient. The complaint was received by the Millbrook Police Department's Internal Affairs Review Office the same afternoon, processed on the following business day, and assigned to a reviewing officer within 72 hours. The reviewing officer classified it as a procedural complaint with a secondary notation, a notation that flagged the complaint for cross-reference with the department's prior complaint database, as was standard procedure when a procedural complaint named a specific officer. That cross-reference produced a result. There was a prior complaint against Officer Nate Corbin. It had been filed 14 months earlier by a man named Gerald Tatum, who was 53 years old and owned a small electronics repair shop in Millbrook's West Commercial District. Gerald Tatum was black. The complaint described an incident in which Corbin had responded to a call about a possible break-in at the shop after a neighbor reported seeing movement inside past closing time. The person inside the shop was Gerald Tatum himself, who had returned after hours to retrieve a piece of equipment he had forgotten. Corbin had not questioned Tatum at the door and verified his identity and ownership, which was the standard procedure for this category of call. Corbin had entered the shop behind Tatum, had instructed him to step away from the counter and place his hands where visible, and had questioned him for 22 minutes. 22 minutes about his ownership of the business and his authorization to be in it, requesting documentation that no person should need to produce while standing in their own business after hours. Gerald Tatum had produced the documentation. He had his business license in a folder in his desk drawer where he kept it. The incident ended without arrest. The complaint had been filed the next day. The prior complaint had been reviewed and classified as inconclusive, insufficient evidence to establish misconduct and had been closed. It had not altered Corbin's assignment status. It had sat in the file for 14 months. Doreen Ashby's complaint and the specific circumstances it described was sufficient to reopen it. The cross-reference flagged a pattern that a single incident had not made legible on its own. 2 incidents. 2 black men. 2 separate occasions in which Corbin had encountered a black professional in a professional space that the person was fully and legitimately authorized to occupy. And in both cases, Corbin's first response had been to question the presence challenge the authorization and move toward physical removal or documentation demand before taking any step to verify the person's identity and standing with the person themselves or with the relevant authority at the location. The pattern was not proof of intent. It was not a finding of malice. It was the kind of pattern that, once documented across 2 separate complaints involving the same officer, the same dynamic, and the same demographic of person, required a different category of review than either complaint had received individually. The Internal Affairs Review Office notified Corbin. He was placed on modified duty while the investigation proceeded. He was required to attend a procedural review session with his supervising sergeant, Patricia Osei, who was 52 years old and had been with the department for 22 years, and who conducted the session in the direct, specific manner of someone who had done similar sessions before and had learned that directness was more useful to everyone in the room than softening. Corbin arrived at the session with his accounting already formed. He had been responding to a call in both cases. He had been acting on reported information. He had been operating within the procedural framework for responding to reports of unknown individuals in secured spaces. The fact that both incidents involved black men in professional spaces was in his accounting a coincidence produced by the circumstances of the calls and not a coincidence of perception or approach. Patricia Osei listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The review is not about your accounting of your intentions. The review is about outcomes and about whether the procedure applied produced different results for people in situations that should have been handled consistently regardless of who the person was." She said, "In both incidents, you were in the presence of a black professional in a professional space with a report as your starting point. In both cases, the first step was not to verify the person's identity and authorization with the person's own documentation or with the relevant authority at the location. The first step was removal or forced documentation demand." She said, "That is the pattern. That is what we are looking at." She did not tell him what to conclude from this. She told him what the review was examining and why the 2 complaints read together required examination. She gave him no ground to argue against the pattern because the pattern was the observation, not an accusation. Observations do not have counter-arguments. They have responses. What his response was going to be was not yet determined. Corbin left the session with the experience of sitting in a room where the thing being discussed was himself, and where the description did not match his internal description, and where the gap between those 2 descriptions was not crossable with any explanation he had available. Some people in that experience use the gap as information. Some people use it as motivation to close the gap. Some people use it as evidence of someone else's error and carry it that way for years. Which one he would become was not yet visible from the outside. From the outside, he went home and came back to work the next day on desk assignment and waited for the process to conclude. The formal reprimand was issued 6 weeks after the complaint. It was placed in his service file with a notation that it was connected to the reopened prior complaint and the pattern finding. It would be visible to any reviewing officer for the remainder of his time with the department. It specified the procedural failure at Millbrook First Community Bank, with precision failure to contact building authority prior to removing authorized contractor. It noted the prior complaint. It noted the pattern. It was not the end of his career. It was a mark on a record, a permanent document that said this happened on this date and it was wrong and it is recorded. Gerald Tatum received a letter from the Internal Affairs Review Office. The letter told him that his complaint had been reopened and that a finding had been made in a connected case that documented a pattern including his incident. The letter did not restore the 22 minutes he had spent standing in his own shop while an officer demanded his paperwork. It did not undo the particular indignity of being treated as a suspect in your own business by a person with a badge and a gun. It told him that the record had been reopened and that his filing had not in the end gone nowhere. He read the letter twice. He put it in the folder where he kept documents of this kind. He went back to work. Millbrook's City Business Licensing Office was a small department within the Economic Development Division. 6 staff members responsible for the full scope of commercial licensing and certification for the city. On most days, it produced approved renewal certificates and new registration logs. It was not a department that was in the news. The director was Marcus Ellison, 55 years old, 9 years in the position. He received a standard briefing from the city attorney's office about the Millbrook First Community Bank incident and the internal affairs findings. The briefing came through the interdepartmental protocol for complaints originating in commercial environments, which the Business Licensing Office was copied on because such complaints occasionally intersected with the Economic Development Division's function. He read the briefing carefully. He read about Wendell James and James Security Services. He read about the 44 assessments. He read about the 11-year contract and the door code and the contract with both signatures on the cover page. He read about what had happened in the corridor at 9:53 on a Thursday morning. He made a decision. The city had a mechanism for formally acknowledging businesses that had conducted themselves with unusual professionalism, not in the achievement sense, but in the conduct sense. The business commendation was issued by the Economic Development Division and recorded in the Public Business Registry, where it was visible to anyone who searched the business's license record. It was a small thing. Small things were still things. He drafted the commendation himself, which was not standard procedure. Drafting was usually delegated. He felt the particulars required that he do it. He acknowledged in formal language the firm's 11-year record of service, its licensed standing and compliance history, and the specific incident of professional conduct under circumstances that had required more than professionalism. He did not name Corbin in the document. He did not need to. The commendation stood on its own terms, a record of a business, a person, and a body of work. The commendation was mailed to the James Security Services office address. It arrived on a Tuesday. Wendell opened the envelope, read the document, and set it on his desk. He looked at it for a moment in the way you look at something that is both meaningful and not surprising, something that represents a correct accounting of a real thing and that you recognize as correct without needing it to be larger than it is. He filed it in the licensing drawer in the appropriate folder in the order it arrived. The record would hold it. The record would be there. He went back to work, which was finishing the follow-up section of a quarterly report for a different client. A motion sensor that needed repositioning. A lighting gap in an exterior zone. The vocabulary of security work in the city that contained his clients on the ordinary Tuesday afternoon that contained the work. Wendell James completed the 45th assessment at Millbrook First Community Bank and drove to his office in the early afternoon. He sat at his desk. He opened the assessment form. He looked at his notes. He began to write the report. The quarterly assessment report format he used for the bank had been developed in the first year of the contract and refined across 10 more years into a document he was genuinely proud of. Not in a sentimental way, but in the way a person is proud of a tool that has been worked to its correct shape over a long time. It was organized for the reader, which meant it was organized for Doreen Ashby, who read it between other responsibilities, who needed to be able to move from the summary to the specific findings to the follow-up items without confusion or unnecessary rereading. The summary section came first date assessor scope overall finding. Then the building by zone, each element documented in order. Then the follow-up items numbered with recommended timelines and any cross-reference to prior reports. He typed the summary satisfactory with recommendations. He typed the zone sections working through each area of the building in the sequence he had walked it. The security equipment room section required the most text. He described the camera server status, the alarm panel status, the monitor array, and then with the specific precision the finding warranted, he described the camera 7 issue. He wrote the finding in full. Current angle deviation approximately 4 degrees counterclockwise from documented position as of prior quarterly assessment. The deviation had produced a reduction in the camera-to-camera coverage overlap between camera 7 and camera 8 in the exterior rear zone. The reduced overlap created a blind spot of approximately 6 to 8 feet in width at the fence line. The finding was new camera 7 had been within normal parameters at the last assessment, which meant the drift had occurred within the current quarter, most likely as a result of the temperature variation between the late summer assessment and the current fall conditions, which was a known risk factor for adjustable mount cameras installed in exterior adjacent positions. He included a recommendation with a 30-day timeline. He wrote the door seal, finding with the same precision. Lower hinge side quadrant. 8-inch section compression wear functional, but at replacement threshold. He noted the door model for the replacement specification, so the maintenance contractor would not need to verify it separately. 30-day timeline. He reviewed the document. He read it through once from the top. He checked the numbers against the diagrams on his note sheet. He corrected one word. He read it again. He sent it to Doreen at 4:47 in the afternoon. He sent the invoice in the same email thread, the quarterly assessment fee, the service date, 30-day payment terms. The amount was consistent with the current contract terms. He had been billing the same rate for 3 years. The rate was fair for the work, and the work was what had been agreed to, and he charged what had been agreed to without inflation or adjustment. That was how the relationship worked. He closed his computer. He looked at the window. The light outside was doing what it did in the late afternoon at this time of year in this part of the country, going golden and horizontal, falling across the commercial strip in long angles that made the ordinary storefronts look briefly like something worth looking at. He had always liked this hour. He had always liked the specific quality of an afternoon that has been fully used. He had been in a building that morning where a man with a badge had looked at him and decided without asking anyone and without checking anything that his presence was a problem requiring removal. He had been physically directed toward a door. He had had to place his own professional identity on the record in a corridor where his professional identity should have been known without record keeping. He had absorbed the specific weight of a morning that required a kind of composure and restraint that is not distributed equally that some people carry as a standard feature of their professional lives, and some people have never been asked to carry at all, and that is heavier than it looks from the outside and heavier than it needs to be and has been carried for a very long time. He had done all of that, and then he had stood in the doorway of the security equipment room and begun on the left side and worked clockwise and found the 2 things that needed finding and written the report and sent it before 5. Because the camera had drifted 4 degrees and the door seal was at threshold, and those were real conditions in a real building that a real client depended on him to find. And he had found them. That was the work. The work did not ask whether the morning had been fair before it required doing. The work required doing regardless, and the doing was the answer. The bank fixed the camera mount and the door seal within the week. A maintenance contractor remounted camera 7 and resecured the adjustment bolts against future drift. A second contractor replaced the door seal on the security equipment room door using the specification Wendell had included in the report. Doreen sent him an email, 2 for 2 done early. He replied, "Good. See you next quarter." The coverage gap was closed, the door sealed correctly. The building was more secure in these specific and measurable ways than it had been the morning Wendell walked in with his clipboard. That was the work. The work continued. There is a version of this story that would stay in the corridor. That version would dwell on the indignity and the pattern and the weight and the particulars of what it means to stand in a space where you have worked for 11 years and be steered toward the door by someone who did not think to check. That version is not wrong. The indignity was real. The weight was real. The pattern was real, documented, and had consequences for Gerald Tatum, and for everyone else who has ever been in a professional space where someone with institutional authority decided their presence was the question before verifying whether the question was valid. The weight of that does not disappear between incidents. It accumulates. It is carried. These things are true and they deserve to be named. But this story is not only that story. It is also the story of what 29 years of actual work produces. It is the story of 44 assessments and 44 reports and 44 invoices paid on time and 44 corrections made at a client's building because a professional with a clipboard found them. It is the story of a woman who came out of her office and said, "That is Wendell James. He runs the security firm that protects this building. This man has more knowledge of the security infrastructure of this bank than anyone in this room, including me." She said it without hesitation. She said it because it was true and because she had 11 years of evidence for its truth and because the evidence was not diminished by having to be cited. Then she said, "Come on back, Wendell. He has a job to finish." Come on back. It is an instruction that knows what is already true. Not a restoration you cannot restore what was not removed. Not an apology that had been offered separately and accepted in the way it was accepted. Come on back is a statement of orientation. It says the person being addressed belongs in the direction they are going. It says the interruption was the anomaly. It says the resumption is the correction. Wendell James resumed. He took 45 assessments worth of accumulated knowledge of one building in 2 hours and 14 minutes of methodical work, and he found what needed finding and wrote what needed writing and sent it before the deadline and went home. The reprimand went into the file. The prior complaint was reopened. The pattern was documented. Gerald Tatum received a letter. The commendation went into the public registry. Doreen Ashby continued to manage the branch she had managed for 14 years. The camera was adjusted. The door seal was replaced. None of these outcomes are large in the dramatic sense. None of them rearrange anything fundamental about how the world works, or correct what it costs to walk through a professional life carrying something that other people are not required to carry. The costs are real, and they persist, and no formal reprimand or business commendation makes them not real. This should be stated plainly. The accounting that does not account for the cost is an incomplete accounting. What the record holds is the work. 44 assessments before this one. This one. The 46th to come in 3 months when Wendell James will arrive at the staff entrance of Millbrook First Community Bank and enter the door code and walk into the rear corridor and begin on the left side and work clockwise. He will check camera 7's mount to confirm the adjustment has held through the season. He will run his hand along the security equipment room door seal to confirm the replacement is seated correctly and making full contact along the full perimeter. He will check everything that requires checking and note the status of everything he notes and write the report and send it by 5 o'clock. The building will be more secure for it. It has been more secure for it for 11 years. It will continue to be more secure for it for as long as the contract is renewed and the work is done, which is the definition of what it means to show up quarter after quarter and do the work in the buildings of a city that does not always see you clearly, but that is demonstrably safer for your presence in it. That is not a small thing. It only appears small to the people who do not carry the weight of doing it. To the people who do carry the weight, who show up in the navy jacket with the clipboard and the laminated license and the 11 years of knowledge behind their eyes, it is a large thing done quietly in buildings that depend on it without always knowing they do. The work was the answer. It had always been the answer. On this Thursday, as on the 44 Thursdays before it, the work was done. Subscribe our channel if these are the stories you come here to find. We will keep telling them. Some people build their record one quarter at a time in buildings that would not know how to protect themselves without the knowledge those people carry, and the record does not lie even when the corridor does.